Hello everyone, this is your boy AeroFlame coming at you with a video that I'm sure that a lot of you thought wasn't coming. Um, yes, I am here with the Valkorion versus Dark Empire Sidious video. But number one, I'm going to go ahead and start with this. There is going to be a couple changes. I'm going to announce them throughout this video, and the first is going to be this. Welcome. If you're not coming from the TikTok and this is your first time seeing my face, hello, this is me, AeroFlame. Get all this shock and all this surprise out of the way now, and we're going to go ahead and start, okay? So the way that I'm going to talk about this is I'm really just going to go over, how they compare, how they stack up. I'm going to compare, like, their different feats, like the way that they utilize Sith sorcery, different things like that, natural, the obvious things. But I'm also going to try and, integrate a lot of, just looking at the way that the story portrays them and the way that a lot of the characters react to who they are and what they do within the landscape. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and talk about what Palpatine can do and why a lot of people really seem to think that Palpatine is the main winner of this confrontation. So when you're talking about Emperor Palpatine, especially Dark Empire Palpatine, which is like his amped, most powerful form, a lot of the things that people are going to bring up is just all of the statements that he has. Throughout all of Legends, he has so many statements, just so many back to back to back on top of one on top of another, that puts him as the most powerful Sith Lord to ever exist. There's really no like going back and forth on that. If you're going to say that he isn't the most powerful Sith Lord to ever exist, outside of people like Vader, and different things like that who do have some arguments on inverse, it's really difficult to put other people above him. Like, you would be hard pressed to put Darth Bane above him, or people like Naga Sadow above him. It's really difficult to do that simply because it's very clear that the authors intended for him to just be a big cut above the vast majority, like 99.9% of the dark side practitioners within the verse, right? But then you get to someone like Vitiate, someone like Valkorion, and you have to immediately understand that when you're comparing the two of them, the only time where something like that comparison is valid is if you're only talking about something like Vitiate versus Palpatine. And then it becomes very well possible to argue that Palpatine at his strongest when all these statements are being made, he could be stronger than Vitiate. But then you have to take into account that this is Valkorion that you're talking about here. Now, number one, you already have, if Palpatine is stronger than Vitiate, it's not by a long shot. We have it being stated that Vitiate is the strongest of the ancient Sith, surpassed every Sith that comes before him, and this includes people who have been compared to Vader. You have people like Karnez Mur, who Vader believes if he were to use Mur's power to take over and defeat Palpatine, it'd be akin to trading one master over another. You have people, like I mentioned before, like Naga Sadow, who Darth Plagueis in some novels admits inferiority to. He says that their power in the Force should be greater than his, or some such. I'm gonna put the quote somewhere on the screen for you guys to read with the source, so you guys can kind of see where I'm coming from and what the quote specifically is that I'm referring to. Because the way that I'm going to do these, I'm really just going to be talking off the top of my head. I generally, for the most part, I know what the quotes say. I usually speak like I have the gist of it, really. I know it seems like I'm kind of stumbling over myself, but I know the gist of what I'm saying for the most part in reference to the quotes. But I will just be posting them so you guys just know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you guys are ever like, oh, what is Arrow talking about? I have no idea where that's stated. I'll just have the exact wording and where to find it if you want to read it for yourself. Just somewhere along the video here. But anyway, to kind of get back on topic, yeah, we have this shit being stated being stronger than those guys who are all sort of in that ballpark of each other. I don't think that if you believe that Palpatine is stronger than, excluding Dark Empire Palpatine, but if you think that Palpatine is stronger than Vader, I don't think that you're going to say that he's just like Sith lightning Vader, and Vader just kind of just melts and turns to ashes. I don't think that anyone's going to say that Palpatine is stomping out Vader. I don't think that people are going to say that he's stomping out Karnez Mur. I mean, some people might say that, but who knows? But they're all sort of like in that like, or in my opinion, they all appear to be in that relative ballpark of power if you're looking at things in a more reasonable, taking into account all of these different sources. Uh, you're looking at these things reasonably, right? And Vitiate surpasses all of those beings that come before him. Um, so the ballparks, the level of power, aren't exactly as wide and as massive as you would think them to be. Then you have Vitiate then going on to become Valkorion, the Eternal Emperor, where he's significantly stronger, much stronger than he is. You could even argue that he could have gotten a bigger amp than he did from the Ritual of Nathema, right? Because he's doing things like the Ritual of Nathema by the time that he's Valkorion, by the time that he's seen presented as a Sith Emperor, um, that he just wasn't able to do when he initially completed the ritual, right? We see that he's able to perform the Ritual of Nathema with the dark side alone, right? It's stated that he's able to use or make similar effects to Nathema through the dark side alone, and the Ritual of Nathema does things like eats the Force. It consumes things like colors, concepts, sounds, which is just not something that Palpatine and these people around him, like Plagueis, ever have performed. Their levels of Sith sorcery, the levels that they're at, it doesn't match up to the level that Valkorion is on. Um, and the reason that that is, and the reason that it doesn't match up, and the reason that you can't just backscale through that scaling, is because Valkorion at this point, through gaining power, has realized that simply using the dark side of the Force isn't the way to go. It's not the way to achieve the things that he wants, and he has become more than just a dark side practitioner. I'm probably going to have this one on the screen especially. Um, there's a statement that he has just evolved beyond just being just a member of the Sith species. He's something greater than that, made akin to a forced entity, which is very important when you're talking about the comparison between Palpatine and Valkorion. Because a lot of people think that these statements that he is the most powerful Sith automatically means that he supersedes anything that Valkorion can do because Valkorion's a Sith. Valkorion's just not a Sith. By the time that we see him as the Sith Emperor, you can probably argue that he's not just a Sith. He's a being that consumes and eats the Force itself and consumes the life force of others to extend his life. Um, and he also, at a certain point, also just says that mastering simply the dark side of the Force isn't enough. He thinks that mastering the Force itself, rather than just the dark side, is the way to go. So to try and box him in as just a Sith Lord, to automatically put Palpatine above him, is just a little bit of a weird thing to say. Um, but rather than just looking at who's called what and whether or not being the strongest Sith Lord automatically means that you're stronger than Palpatine, we've kind of put a bow on that, I believe, by going over the fact that Palpatine, or rather Valkorion, isn't a Sith Lord at all, right? By the time that we see him as Valkorion at his peak, he's just like a Sith entity, a freakish thing. You know what I mean? Like just a weirdo. We could sort of call him. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next thing we're gonna talk about is just the feats that they have, like what they look like, their sorcery, their ability to use different Force abilities and stuff like that. We're gonna go ahead and compare those, so I can go ahead and put that into perspective as well. So one thing that's super interesting and one thing that's kind of obvious that doesn't often get brought up um, is the effect that the dark side sort of has on the vessels of Valkorion and Sidious. I'm sure everybody knows what Sidious looks like. Gross. Like he's disgusting looking. While Valkorion, he's a handsome, chiseled, diamond jawline man like myself. And when you compare the two of them, it's very clear which one of the two of them has had more effect on the vessel. And that's super interesting because we see that there actually is an explanation for that. The reason that it looks like that way is because of what the dark side does to the physical body after a certain amount of time, right? the dark side is eventually going to start corrupting the vessel and making it look more and more disgusting, and that's why these different dark side users end up usually looking like someone took a meat mallet to their face. You know what I mean? They have these sunken in eyes, the orange pupils, etc., and that's just a byproduct of being a practitioner of the dark side of the Force. Now, the interesting thing is that Valkorion, just after a while, doesn't get affected by this. We see that Vitiate, like the original body, seems to be just pretty gross looking, you know. But Valkorion himself is a very handsome looking man, and it appears as though he's looked that way for a long time with no sort of, what's the word? Decline in his appearance. We even see in the cinematics, we see that what Valkorion looks like when Archon and Valen and all of them are children, and then we see what he looks like when they're in their adulthood. Like, it looks to be like they're in their 20s, you know what I mean? And he literally hasn't aged a day. Meanwhile, the moment that Valkorion's, or rather, the moment that Palpatine's illusion drops, and that's what's stated to have happened in the behind the scenes, or yeah, I think it's called a. Now, this is look, I just had to check my sources really quick. This is also brought up in both Star Wars Visionaries and their little D&D game for Star Wars. I believe that's called Star Wars Miniatures and Star Wars the Role-Playing Game by Wizards of the Coast. Both of them imply that he uses the ability of Sith Alchemy Mask to sort of hide his appearance to make him look like the Chancellor Palpatine that we know. You know what I mean? So he's not able to stop the deterioration of his physical shell in the same way that Valkorion is. And I think it's very interesting to think about that when we're saying who has a more potent control of the dark side of the Force. Because that alone is just a pretty big indicator, I believe, that one of them is just able to stop what should be a natural side effect of using the dark side of the Force, and one of them isn't. Another thing that I find super interesting is the whole essence transfer, and the main reason that you even talk about Dark Empire Palpatine in the first place, in that he transferred himself to a new body, which should be stronger than the body that he held before. Now, the reason that this is so interesting is because he doesn't want to use voices, right? Voices are a concept that are brought up in Darth Plagueis's So, in Darth Plagueis' Book of the Sith, Secrets from the Dark Side, we see him talk a lot about voices as it's transferring this idea of immortality. And I think it's interesting when we talk about this idea of immortality, because Valkorion is really the only Sith Lord or practitioner of the Force that we see reach the level of immortality that is present within all of Star Wars, right? In active conflict, Abeloth only lives for what? 4, 5, 6 years. Palpatine was only alive for what, 10, 15, 20 years, while Valkorion is active for hundreds, thousands of years. You know what I mean? And through all this time, he's maintaining voices, right? So not only is he extending his life far beyond what any other Sith Lord has been able to extend their life to while in active conflict, but he's also creating voices, which Darth Plagueis says is just ridiculously hard. When we see that transfer life, which is what Valkorion is doing here, is ridiculously difficult when doing it on an unwilling living being, right? We see that when Palpatine attempts to take over someone against their will, he fails each time. He fails when he attempts to take over Anakin Solo. He fails to take over the Jedi this name is insane. Empatogeus Brand. He fails to enter. He takes his body. He tries to take over his body. The Jedi kind of takes him into him, and they die, and they're able to make Palpatine stay in the other realm by virtue of every Jedi that came before is going to keep him there. Blah 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 blah. Right. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that Valkorion has or rather, Palpatine has consistently tried to transfer life to beings that didn't want him to be inside, and he was rejected each time. Meanwhile, Valkorion is able to go out and make multiple voices that he maintains with a range that is on a galactic scale, right? They say that he has voices all over the galaxy, and there's such a vast variety that there are multiple groups of them with multiple different names, right? And there are some that he has had like failsafe, uh, so like taken aback that they have no idea that Valkorion has even planted a seed inside of them. And he can just take over them whenever he wishes, unless they have some sort of external outside assistance. And I think that's very interesting because Palpatine just never takes the risk to do that. He never thinks to himself, oh, if it's that easy to just make multiple voices across the galaxy and to keep parts of myself alive through this, and if you're going to make the claim that, oh, he's doing it to people that aren't particularly force sensitive or this, that, and the other, so it's not as impressive, well, if it's that easy, Palpatine would have done it then instead of just trying to take over Anakin Solo or something like that. And he would have manipulated the midichlorians with his ability in the Force if it was just that easy to just take over another entity. The only answer can be is that this transfer essence, the use of voices, is something that Palpatine thought was too risky. It's beyond him. But Valkorion thought it was just like an everyday thing. It's not difficult for him. It displays to us that Valkorion just has a different level, a higher degree of mastery in the Force with Sith sorcery that people like Plagueis and people like Palpatine just don't have. It's difficult to say that Palpatine is a more skilled user in the Force and a more skilled Sith sorcerer and has learned all the Sith sorcery of the Sith in the past. If people like Valkorion, who once again is a Force entity, so it makes sense for Palpatine not to know how to do this as effectively, it makes sense for him to just be so far beyond them. Like, he's just displaying the ability to casually do something that both Plagueis and Palpatine find extremely risky. Uh, and it's just, you can't say that that's not an extremely impressive feat of skill in the Force. It's just impossible. So next we're gonna just sort of like talk about how they're portrayed and the way that the story presents them, um, to sort of go further into just the comparison between the two and why I believe that Valkorion is just that much more impressive than anything Sidious has kind of shown. Um, so when you talk about Sidious and you talk about the things that he's done, the things that he's accomplished, and you look at the things that Valkorion have accomplished, you kind of get this sense that whoever was writing it, I don't know if they either had Palpatine in mind or they always wanted Valkorion to be the superior emperor, but he's just a lot more impressive. One second. He he shows off a lot better feats. He's able to keep his empire running for a lot longer. And on top of that, he keeps a simultaneous empire running at the same time. Because as you know, while he has the Vitiate mask on, he's also in control of the Eternal Fleet, which is able to body both the Sith and the Jedi at the same time. This sort of thing is just nothing that no other sort of emperor has been able to do. No other emperor, no other leader of the dark side has ever been able to take like their own force and bring it to bear against the entirety of the Jedi and the Sith Order without using some sort of treachery, right? We have Palpatine not feeling ready to move on the galaxy until he executed Order 66 and made it so a lot of the Jedi were just dead before feet hit the ground. Meanwhile, Valkorion is just like, I'm the big guy on the playground. You know, I'll Batista bomb anybody who thinks that they can hold me. And I think that it's super interesting that they portray that, and a lot of people don't really pick up on that. A lot of people don't pick up on the fact that Valkorion is just dominating, completely manhandling two factions at the same time. in such a way that it's nearly impossible for anybody to do anything. Nobody seems like it seems like nobody can get their feet off the ground against him, and that's super duper impressive. And that's something that Palpatine just isn't able to do. Anytime anybody catches wind of what that little weasel is up to, it takes less than a decade for somebody to take him out. Valkorion's been actively scheming for centuries, and it took the active intervention of the Force, bringing back multiple Force ghosts, in order to defeat Valkorion. And I think that that's something that needs to be touched on and needs to be looked at seriously when you're having a discussion like this. You also have to take into account the things that's said about them, right? You have Valkorion being like a fourth entity, as I described before. He's something that's beyond the simple dichotomies of the light side and the dark side of the Force. He says something along the lines of, there is no death, there is only the Force, and I am its master. While Palpatine, like I said, is really just focused on being a monolith of the dark side of the Force. Now, don't get me wrong, right? He's very impressive. He shows us some very, very, very impressive feats, but they're only impressive within the scope of it being within the dark side of the Force, right? We can't say ever that Palpatine is a more effective user of the Force than Valkorion is, because Valkorion not only mastered the dark side of the Force, but he also recognized the need, right? He recognized the need to go ahead and master the other side of the Force. He does not feel as though mastering the dark side of the Force is enough. He feels as though one needs to master the Force truly to be a user of the Force. That's what Valkorion believes, and when you're comparing that to someone who only controls the dark side of the Force, then it becomes really hard to convince anyone that the person who only uses one half of the Force at a master level is more powerful than someone who uses all facets of the Force on a masterful level. This is sort of contextualized further when we put it in the context of comparing Valkorion to the ones of Mortis. There's a statement from FOTJ Apocalypse. You're still thinking on a mortal scale like Vader or Palpatine, right? Where it sort of makes it out that there's this sort of human sort of like this guy level of power versus, you know, this entity, this transcendental being level of power, right? And a super interesting about that is, once again, going back to the whole age thing in the physical body, no mortal, no being is able to extend their lifespan beyond a certain degree, right? Even the Father feels his life coming to an end, and he felt his power is gradually declining over the past 2,000 years or so, right? It's consistently stated that Valkorion is the immortal, the eternal emperor, right? That's the whole thing, right? The thrones of eternity, the eternal empire, everything is about how he is immortal. He is the end-all, be-all. He's going to live forever if nobody comes and chops his head off, right? And I think that that's super interesting because there's constant representation, constant uses of these ideas that Valkorion is not mortal anymore, right? He's not eating steak and souffle up in his, you know, mansion. That's not what he's eating. The thing that he's dining on is like life force, different things like that. Like he's consuming the Force itself. And I think that's the best way to sort of contextualize it. Palpatine really works in the way that he's going to manipulate midichlorians. He's going to work with the Senate. He's going to do this, that, and the other. He's going to work with the system that he's in, while Valkorion more so views the Force as something to be controlled, not to be worked within. He views it as something that he can just manipulate to his whims, while Palpatine more so focuses on operating within it. Palpatine more so comes as a more like masterful user of something, while Valkorion is the master of something, right? And I think that's the comparison, that's the difference between the two of them that people have to get through and understand when you're talking about these two beings, right? Palpatine is worried about, you know, getting eternal life still. Valkorion has eternal life. He's beyond that. The ritual of nothing is done. He knows how to flip flap. He's gonna live forever. He's worrying about what he can do in order to make himself stronger, more powerful. And by the time that we see him at the end of it, he just wants to destroy everything. He wants everybody to be dead. He's just psychotic. He doesn't care about ruling anymore, right? Um, and I think that that's super important when you're comparing that to Palpatine, who's still chasing after eternal life, whose body isn't immune to the ravages of time, who hasn't lived centuries and been active for centuries without failing, right? Like, he made the Death Star twice and got lost. He's a loser. But the Eternal Fleet dominated as so long as Valkorion was around. The reason that things started falling apart isn't because Valkorion messed up. It's because someone went for his head. Uh, there was no spoiling of his plans outside of him being vitiate. Once you get to Valkorion, Valkorion is the sort of guy that is just always successful, so long as things are running to his plans and his specifications. But the moment that they cut off the head, that's when the Eternal Empire started slowing down and things started going in a way that wasn't exactly the way that Valkorion wanted them. And I think that that's super interesting because Palpatine doesn't have that sort of longevity. Palpatine isn't that sort of villain where, you know, you're trying to prevent Palpatine from getting his short-term goal, right? Once he gets immortality, then he's gonna think about the big picture. But Valkorion's already at the big picture, right? He's already been around and active for hundreds of years, and no one's been able to stop him, right? Legions have risen up to test him, and they've all failed. He has the patience of stars and the will of stone, right? We're more so looking at the long term. We're trying to stop Palpatine, or rather, we're trying to stop Valkorion now, right? This is generation 4, 5, 6 that have had to deal with this guy, right? And we need to stop him right here, right now. Like, he's already achieved many of the things that he set out for, and he's been able to keep that dominance for so much longer. And it makes sense when it's put into the context of Vader and Palpatine and guys like that. You know, they're at a mortal level of power, right? Even when you get to the Dark Empire, he's still worried about his clone bodies. He's still worried about, oh, I need to find someone that I can try and jump into as fast as I can. My body's aging, etc., etc. Valkorion's beyond that, right? The story has long since established that Valkorion's not meant to be on that mortal scale of power, right? He's not meant to be at the level where, because even when they defeat him in the end, they have to fight a nerfed, weakened version of Valkorion both times. The second time that he's defeated as Valkorion with the help of the Force, he doesn't understand his background. He doesn't have access to all the hacks and different abilities that he has. Or when he's defeated the first time as Valkorion, they have to use his own Sith sorcery spell against him to weaken his body after Valen's learned to control more of her power. And I think that meanwhile Palpatine's just jumping into the wrong guy, and that guy's just like, bleh, I'm gonna kill myself, and then that's it. That's the end of Palpy. Like, Valkorion would be stopped by something like that. And that's what you have to realize when you're thinking about, like, what does it mean when you're talking about how narratively powerful, how narratively impactful a villain is? Would something like that stop a villain of Valkorion's level? And the answer is no, right? He has too many abilities, he's too powerful, he has too many fail-safes set in place that that sort of thing wouldn't happen unless the living force, like it does in the most recent DLC that he's in, actively intervenes in the situation. So that's sort of my thoughts on that. That's my thoughts on why Valkorion would be able to defeat Sidious, why he'd be able to like pick him up in Batista Bomb. He gives him a noogie, you know what I mean? I just think that the levels of power that they're at, the statements and the things surrounding them, and the way that the narrative uses them as villains just displays that they're in two different leagues, right? They're not meant to be compared to each other because Valkorion isn't a Sith Lord. Valkorion's not like just a dark side practitioner. He's not that kind of guy. Palpatine's not some like force-consuming super being. He doesn't consume concepts. He doesn't eat sound, right? He eats steak and eggs, right? Like, the two of them aren't meant to be compared. And that's just the way that I feel. So once again, we're going to be having videos like this every week. Next week is going to be the Ichiro versus Comp, Kengan Astra, Kengan Omega, that everybody's been asking me for, so shut up! You know what I mean? I'm kidding. So thank you all for watching the video. Oh, and if you're going to be coming to the Pokemon Radical Red Nuzlocke, that's going to be this Saturday. We're going to be doing it a little bit earlier because I'm going to be stepping out of town, going to Orlando. So we're going to be doing it at around 4:30. Probably going to be about a 2.5 hour long stream. So be there if you want to hang out with me, ask me questions, see what videos or suggestions you can give. And thank you. Thanks for watching the video.